Hey, and welcome to what would be the Week 14 recap, but I'm going to forgo the recap in favor of a different topic of conversation. In fact, I'm going to do a short one here. Basically, not a lot happened that was unexpected. Michigan State won the Big Ten, but Iowa put up a much better fight than a lot of people thought they would. So a lot of it ended up the same. The top four are pretty much as predicted. It's Clemson at number one, Alabama at number two, Michigan State jumps up to number three, and Oklahoma at number four. But it's essentially the same four teams everybody predicted or supposed would be there. So basically, it was going to be Alabama. It was going to be Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, and then the winner of the Big Ten, and that's exactly what it is. So not much of a mix-up. The matchups are going to be interesting, but what I want to talk about today is something that a lot of people are referring to as the case for 8. In other words, instead of a 14 playoff, there's been cases in the last 2 years for an 18 playoff. So I want to look at last season for starters. Numbers 1 through 4, we already know were Ohio State, Alabama, Oregon, and Florida State. Not necessarily in that order, but still, those were the 4 teams. So, given that information, who were the ones out? Number 5 was Baylor. They were the first team out. Number 6 was TCU. They were the second team out. Then it was Mississippi State, and then it was Michigan State. So there's a case for each of those teams to potentially be in the playoffs, in a playoff matchup. It wasn't as strong a case last year as it is this year, and here's why. Because I'm going to go. There were cases for all of them last year, but more strongly for Baylor and TCU. Baylor could have played almost anyone in that top 4 and beaten them, and TCU, I think, the same thing. So it was interesting. They got left out. Mississippi State, they had a bad game against Ole Miss at the end of the season, but they only lost to Alabama at Alabama by 5 points in the regular season. So that they had a chance to go at it. Michigan State lost a close game against Oregon and had a bad game against Ohio State as well. So I mean, their 2 losses were 2 teams in the playoffs. So there was a case where the 5 through 8 were all strong teams that season. Now we come to this season. And I honestly think this season makes a much better case for the top 8 for a top 8 playoffs instead of a top 4 playoffs. And here's why. We look at the teams that are left out right now. We start with number 5, Iowa. Iowa's a one-loss team. They lost to Michigan State. If they had not lost the Big Ten championship game, which they lost in the final minute, actually the final 30 seconds of the game is when they lost it, they would be in the playoffs right now, not Michigan State. So they have a strong case where they could play almost anyone in the top 4. Next in line is Stanford. Now, Stanford's a 2-loss team, but they're the Pac-12 champion. Now, their first loss was to a Northwestern team that surprised everyone this season and played hella good defense. So that's a team that they lost to in the very season opener, where a lot of teams play not as well as they did. I think if they were to play right now, Stanford would win that game. The next game that Stanford lost, which was a very close one, was to Oregon, a team that, had they not lost their quarterback for 3 games, could have been in the running for the playoffs again this year. Another point for Stanford is their regular season ending win over Notre Dame. They won by 2 points on the last-second field goal to beat Notre Dame in a game where Notre Dame stopped McCaffrey, essentially. Like, they held him back in terms of what he normally does. And Stanford still performed offensively. So they proved themselves in that. Now, the next team was Ohio State. Now, Ohio State's case is already made as well as Iowa's is, because Iowa's only losses to Michigan State. Ohio State's only losses to Michigan State. In fact, Ohio State would have been in that Big Ten championship game if they hadn't had that bad game. Now, it was a lot of play calling issues and whatnot, but they still lost to Michigan State, but I think they could beat them if they played again. So Ohio State has a case made for them. They're number 7. Next in line, Notre Dame at number 8. Notre Dame has 2 losses as well. Now, Notre Dame's not in a conference, so they don't have a conference championship. But they lost to Clemson by 2 points because they missed the 2-point conversion that would have sent it to overtime. Now, that being said, they played that game in Death Valley in awful weather, and they still came within 2 points. And I think if they make that 2-point conversion and go to overtime, Notre Dame would have won that game based on how the game ended. Clemson held on to win. They were way ahead of Notre Dame and coming into the fourth quarter, and Notre Dame scored almost all of their points in the fourth quarter. They only scored that 1 field goal in the first half, and then the rest of their points came in the fourth quarter. I think Notre Dame was on a roll there. If they go to overtime, I think Notre Dame would have continued to roll and might have won the game. Notre Dame's other loss is to Stanford. Now, Stanford beat Notre Dame on a last-second field goal. Notre Dame handled McCaffrey better than anyone has this season. So I think that was a case for Notre Dame making it, because they've proven they can handle big teams, big games. They only lost that one by 2, and it was a late defensive meltdown on one play, really, the big passing play that set up the field goal. One play, and Notre Dame could have won that game too, and would have been in the running for the playoff at that point. It would have been a much more harder choice to pick who would be number 4. So that's the individual case for each team. Now, let's talk about how the top 8 would work. It would only add an extra week to what is already in place with the 4-team playoff. And what it would do is it would change. The first week would be you do highest plays lowest. So number 1 would play number 8. Number 2 would play number 7. Number 3 would play number 6. And number 4 would play number 5. And you work that way. And then in the second round, it's the same thing. You just, if number 1 beats number 8, number 1 moves on. If number 7 beats number 2, number 7 moves on. In the next round, number 1 would play number 7, and whoever wins the other 2 games would play each other. Now let's say number 1 wins, number 2 wins, and number 3 wins, and number 5 wins. 1 would play 5, 2 would play 3. So that's essentially how it would work, and then the winners of the next round would play for the national championship as it works right now. So, that being said, the matchups this year, which is why I think it makes a better case, would be, starting with number 1 versus number 8, would be Clemson versus Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame, we already talked about how that game went. I think on even field in potentially better weather, Notre Dame would win that game. Has a very good chance at winning that game. They may not outright win it, but they have a very good chance at it. So that being said, I think that one would be a really close, really fun game to win. Clemson may still win it, but it could be a very exciting game to watch in the playoffs. And like I said, it's a toss-up at that point. It could go either way. But the fact that Notre Dame at number 8 has a chance that they could beat number 1 is proving the point that we should extend it to 8. The next on the list is number 2 versus number 7. That would be Alabama versus Ohio State. Now, the interesting thing about this setup is it is a rematch of last year's playoff game between these 2 teams. And Ohio State won that one. And I think they could win this one as well. However, Nick Saban at Alabama has a track record of not losing to the same team twice in a row, at least not that often. So therefore, I think Alabama could beat Ohio State, but I think Ohio State could also beat Alabama. They match up really well against each other, and I think that is another case that number 7 has a chance to beat number 2. Next in line, Stanford at number 6 would play number 3 Michigan State. Michigan State has experience stopping monster running backs. They had to handle Ezekiel Elliott earlier this season, and while play calling did help that, they still kept him in control. Even though the play calling wasn't that great, when Ezekiel Elliott got the ball, he didn't do very much with it. So what I'm saying is I think Michigan State can put a lid on McCaffrey if they focus on him. Now, if you go to Stanford on that, Stanford proved in that game against Notre Dame that even if you put a bottle on McCaffrey, their offense is not crippled. McCaffrey had 113 total total offensive yards in the game against Notre Dame. No touchdowns. 94 rushing, 19 receiving, no touchdowns. That means that total offensive yardage without McCaffrey, Stanford still put up 309 yards and scored 38 points. And that's without their superstar that people say if you bottle him up, they can't do it. So they proved they can, and I think that they proved they could beat Michigan State, but Michigan State could beat them as well. So I think that's a great case for those two, for Stanford making the playoffs as well, even though they're at number 6. Next is Iowa and Oklahoma, number 4 and number 3, number 4 and number 5. Iowa's defense is the star of their team, and they are a really good defense. You saw how they handled Michigan State after Michigan State came off a 55-point game, I believe, against Penn State. That is impressive. That is an impressive way to manhandle that offense. That being said, Oklahoma is a team that consistently scores really well in games. So, to put those two together, it would be an interesting matchup. I think Oklahoma could win that game. It has a slight edge on it just because their offense is so good, and Iowa's offense is not bad. They're just not great, but they're good enough. They're good enough with the defense they have. So I think Iowa has a chance in that matchup still. So when I can look at what all 4 matchups would be in an 8-team playoff this year and say, well, yeah, they have a chance. Everybody has a chance at winning those. And I can look at last year's and say, well, I could see Mississippi State beating Alabama. I could see Michigan State maybe trying to get revenge on Ohio State. I could see TCU taking on Oregon. It starts to loosen up a little. I could see. Sorry, I'm doing this backwards. Ohio State was number 4, so Michigan State would take on Alabama. So Michigan State, Alabama, I think they matched up well last year. Then Mississippi State would take on Oregon. That could be an interesting matchup. If TCU were going to have to play Florida State, I think they could have beat Florida State, especially how badly Oregon beat them last year. And number 5, Baylor, I think they could have beaten Ohio State as well. So it was very interesting that I can look at all 4 matchups of the last 2 years that would have been the top 8 matchups and see, well, this team could have won. It's proving that there's a case for 8. Now, the one thing I will say, because I'm running out of time, is that even though if you make this jump, it won't be for a few years. But each year they delay it is just more and more evidence that it should be that way. Now, that being said, there are going to be the occasional seasons where the lower tier of the top 8 just aren't as good as the higher tier. And that's going to happen, but it's going to be so few times. Like, if you look back at the history of the NCAA recently, that there wasn't much discrepancy between number 8 and number 4 and number 8 and number 1 in a lot of seasons. Now, that being said, I'm not expecting number 8 to win every time against number 1, but I'm expecting that it could happen every season. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you like, If you like what I'm doing, subscribe to my videos, click the like button below, and I will be back tomorrow with my prediction for the Navy Army game and a little bit of history on the game as well. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you tomorrow.